Off in the salty ocean, off where the waves roll free. The sparkling water rises, then crashes to the sea. Out amongst the breakers, you'll have no need to fear. It's true, it's the blue frontier.
Welcome to another episode of Rising Tide, the Ocean Podcast. This is David Helvarg, and my co-host is Vicki Nichols Goldstein of the Inland Ocean Coalition. How's it going, Vicki?
Oh, it's going wonderfully well, and I'm very excited about our conversation today.
And today we're talking with Jamie Workman and Amanda Leland, co-authors of Sea Change, a 2025 book that Publishers Weekly calls, quote, an upbeat portrait of a revitalized global fishing industry. But first, some blue news you can use. President Trump says offshore wind is, quote, driving the whales a little batty. Surely, if not the whales, then Trump himself. Ever since the government of Scotland approved an offshore wind project off his local golf resort in 2013, Trump has claimed wind farms are ugly, cause cancer, kill whales, and has excluded them from his energy dominance drill baby drill plan for a fossil fuel future of U.S. climate disruption. While the Biden administration encouraged the building of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind power by 2030, that would have powered 10 million homes with clean energy and created 77,000 jobs. In his second term, Trump and his team have done all they can to sabotage this emerging green energy sector. First, they tried to shut down the 80% completed Revolution Wind project off Rhode Island last year, but a federal judge stopped them. Then in December, they placed a stop work order on all 5 major East Shore offshore wind projects, claiming they were a national security threat, although the Pentagon had already approved them. This time it took 5 judges to rule that all 5 projects can continue. But for major investors like Danish energy company Ørsted and France's Total Energy, the writing is on the wall, scrawled in coal dust and tar. Now the Trump administration has just signed an agreement to pay Total Energy almost $1 billion to cancel planned wind projects off New York and North Carolina. It will reimburse exactly $923 million from U.S. taxpayers to reclaim offshore lease sites in exchange for the French company's pledge to invest a similar amount in oil and gas development. Plus, by shutting down this renewable energy industry, they're saving the beaches, coastal economies, and communities of the eastern seaboard potential ruin and devastation in the event of a massive uncontrolled wind spill. Oh no, wait, that's offshore oil I'm thinking of. The Trump administration wants to massively expand offshore oil drilling. And that's blue news you can use. Jamie Workman is an author, journalist, entrepreneur whose widely seen works include his award-winning book, Heart of Dryness. He also founded AquaShares, a firm that pioneered water credit trading, and has worked on wildfire restoration, dam removal, wolf releases, and other fun and productive stuff. Amanda Leland, who fell in love with the sea when her granddad took her fishing at 5, and who I met when she was working to stop overfishing some 20 years ago, is today executive director of the Environmental Defense Fund that seeks to bring shareholders together to support healthy communities and economies while addressing climate impacts, even as the world burns. This book's so engaging and raises so many questions. Let's just jump right in. And Vicki, ask the first question.
So your book tells a rare success story in ocean conservation. And at its core, I really want to get to this whole concept of what is sea change and what do you want people to understand?
Well, I'm a child of 2 teachers. And so I grew up thinking if we can just get the ideas out there, if we can just get the facts in front of people, they will change their ways. And what the story is about is not trying to convert people one by one to have epiphanies, but rather to change the system of incentives so that you align the interests of nature, of the public, and of private enterprise like commercial fishermen into the same thing, the same outcome, that they all want more fish in the sea. They all want more food on the plate. They want more profitable and prosperous communities. And this is the story of that conversion, of that transition from a race to deplete the ocean, a literal race to the bottom of the sea, to one where we're rebuilding it successfully, and how that happened in America and how we're starting to translate those lessons overseas and into other natural resource issues.
another sort of lens to that is the importance of humans and what human leadership can do to really drive those changes. There's so much about what I do as an environmentalist that's about getting the institutions right. But fundamentally, if the leadership isn't there, if it's not in a position to make change, it will not last. It probably won't happen to begin with. And so I think another part of what comes through in sort of the concept of sea change is the human drive to make this a better world. And that can mean different things to different people, but the intentionality of that is really important.
So catch shares seem to shift incentives, as you mentioned, Jamie, and fishermen can now fish safer, plan better, and avoid this whole race to the fish. So in simple terms, how does that actually change the behavior of fishermen?
Or what is catch shares exactly?
Yeah. So the way I think about it is the race to fish, this very more conventional fisheries management approach, is really about regulators' attempts to constrain fishermen's behavior in order to control the catch. So as you have a declining fishery and there are less fish out there for the fishermen to catch, regulators respond by saying you can only have this kind of an engine on your boat, or you can only catch this amount of fish per trip. And if you're a fisherman and your job is to catch fish to provide for your family, if you can only catch so many fish per trip, what are you going to do?
Run, get out there.
That's right. You're going to take more trips, right? And so it ends up being this like frenzied situation where the regulators aren't really good at constraining the catch, but the fishermen are really good at responding with all the ways around to try to make a living. So that's the race to fish. So a catch share, and that word is hard to hear for the first time, so I'm saying it slowly on purpose. A catch share is different. The Alaska halibut fishery, as it was in decline, had a season opener of 2 days.
2 days.
2 days in the year the fishermen could go fishing. There was an actual gunshot, like a starting point gunshot, and all the boats went out on the same time, tried to catch as much as they could and then bring them back. And so what that did was it meant that fishermen weren't paying attention to safety. It meant that everybody was competing with everybody else. And when they all brought their fish back at the same time, there's a glut on the market and they get a depressed price per pound at the dock. So they're not even earning a decent living. And typically the quality of the fish is low because they're all in this frenzied race trying to do as much as they can as fast as they can before the time runs out.
It's just dangerous, those derbies. When I was up there working on my Coast Guard book and talking with the Coasties, they said, those derbies, we had so many SAR, search and rescue cases, and now it's much easier on the fishermen and on us. I said, yeah, you get to relax. And they looked at me weirdly and said, this is Alaska. We don't get to relax.
But you don't have to go out on these horrible, stormy, dangerous days. You can choose.
You take the chaos out of the system. You can sort of de-risk it a lot more if you make this switch to catch shares. So a catch share is really about science setting a total amount of fish that can be caught in a year. That's my circle. Think of it as a pie. Mm-hmm. And then each fisherman or community or company or however it's determined to be allocated gets a slice of that pie. And the fishermen know from the beginning of the year, I have this slice, this amount of fish that I get to catch anytime during the year. And the important thing is that the pie is the total amount that can be caught. So in a rebuilding scenario, when the fish are rebounding in the ocean, the pie gets bigger. And what happens to each slice as the pie gets bigger? It gets bigger too. And so the fishermen now have this built-in incentive to want to get the pie to grow because they'll be able to catch more fish. And they start to move from this very short-term framework of like, I got to catch as much as I can, as fast as I can before the other guy does, to I want to get a high price per pound. I want to reduce my costs. I want to slow things down. And I'm going to save a little for next year because I know as the pie gets bigger, I'm going to catch more next year.
Historically, indigenous fishing in North America was a collaborative, cooperative process, but most of the fishermen I've known have been the sort of rugged individuals. I'm in competition and I'm the best highliner. And that's the story you tell in the book about Buddy. So maybe you could briefly tell us how the rugged individual competitive fisherman buys into a system that's about allocations and shares, and you don't win by being the best fisherman.
Well, the main thing is Buddy didn't buy into that. He was totally against that. He was kicking ass. He was the highliner. He was the one catching more snapper and grouper than anyone else. And so he's just like, look, I'm going to be the last guy afloat. I really feel bad, and I'll help these guys out if they're in trouble. But when they go bankrupt or exit the fishery, I can start going after what's left behind. So it was a very much the classic, as you say, man versus nature. And then he lost 2 votes. We like to humiliate him about that. And then 3 months later, he said, wait a second, I've been looking at my books. This is actually working. I'm making more money, catching less fish, looking ahead 5 years. This is something I want my sons to get into. He started thinking, I want to find out more about this thing that I've been voting against. And as he did, an interesting thing happened. He's like, well, who sets this? And the other fishermen say, well, we do. And so when they started planning this, they started realizing we are the ones that are co-creating this fishery with environmentalists like Amanda, with the fisheries scientists, with the environmental managers, the fisheries managers. And it's now not me versus them or us versus the man, the government. We're all in this together. And some extraordinary things then start to happen. And they want to start sharing their data. I don't need to have an exclusive, no one can know where I'm catching my fish because that's my competitive advantage. That fish is going to be out there waiting for me. So the data, and this is on the West Coast as well, especially, we can share that. And as we share that, we start finding out where the overfished species are, where the nurseries are, and we start wanting to protect those. And I very much start using we instead of I, because they're no longer competing over a finite supply. And they start forming associations. The Reef Fish Shareholders Alliance never existed before, but once that formed, they start looking at other things like, should we start presenting our case to government? Fishermen, as Z Grader knows, never really had that kind of unified voice for the fishermen. We're too busy competing with each other to catch the last fish to have time to educate our legislators on what's a good policy. They started saying, well, if we did set aside some no-take zones or no-trawl zones on the West Coast, we'd put it here. And the environmentalists are like, really? That's great, because we would like to put it here as well. And the fishermen are saying, well, our data is showing that some of these species that you want to protect are moving north. It was like, oh, okay, well, we'll adjust this. That's never happened before, where like fishermen and environmentalists were getting together in a room and collaborating to fence themselves out of a protected area. And they're just no longer thinking about today and tomorrow. They're thinking 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the road. And that incentive just changes the personal dynamic entirely. And that's what makes it exciting, that you can scale this instead of, as I said, trying to convert someone like Buddy one person at a time, which is really slow. They start to follow their own motivations and their behaviors change because of the incentives.
I was really fascinated with your topic on fuel efficiency and how these catch shares really influence just not only the fisheries, but fuel use and the whole entire carbon footprint of fishing.
When we think of climate and oceans, obviously you're thinking of rising tide, the title of this podcast. You're thinking of acidification. You're thinking of coral bleaching. You're thinking of warming waters. And that's all really important and something we have to figure out, how do we build in resilience and adaptation? But the sort of the secret, well-kept secret, other than the fisheries are recovering, is that fishermen are slowing down. With the end of the race that Amanda described, you're no longer rewarded for having the most powerful engine of going out 3-4 times a day to catch your 2,000-pound limit. And you're not having to go as far. You're not having to go as fast. So you're able to fish closer to shore. And so Buddy starts looking at his fuel bills and saying, man, this is great. I'm now using 20% of the fuel, which was probably one of his biggest costs, maybe after labor, but in most of these fisheries, and at every level, artisanal fisheries as well, that's the biggest expense. So if you can lower that fuel outlay, your profits start booming.
In the U.S., along with this system, of course, you also have NOAA fisheries enforcement, the U.S. Coast Guard for enforcement. I think one of the many challenges is we just had a high seas treaty that says we're going to try and protect half the world is basically the ocean outside of national exclusive economic zones. And out there, it's outlaws and slave labor on longliners. And there's no enforcement out there. So maybe we could transition to how you get from a system that works in a well-regulated country like the US to how you do the enforcement and the systems in other countries where maybe the local fishermen are being beaten down by distant fishing fleets that are coming from other countries and basically raping their waters.
So I think actually Belize is a really good example of this. About 15-ish years ago, EDF also started working in Belize with Belizean communities and Belizean fishermen and the fisheries department to put in place this kind of management, a catch share system in the coral reef ecosystem with the small scale fishermen that are there. And so they did a catch share program that is a little bit different than the one I described. It's area based, not total allowable catch based. So they have area systems that small fishing communities essentially proctor. They get access to them and then they defend their territory. In this turf model, in the first year of the program, illegal fishing went down 60%. 60% because they now had the incentive to report people who were fishing in the no-take zones that were like adjacent or illegally fishing in their waters. And the government was able to send people out and tag them. And this happened there were stories of in families. People were telling on their brother or their in-law who was also out there illegally fishing. And that never had happened before because it was in their self-interest. I say that without it being a bad thing, but it was in their self-interest to want to protect their local fishing territory. And the other thing that happened in that first year is that all of the fishermen, more than 90% of them began reporting all of their catch data. So it creates this transparency in the system where there's self-enforcement, which is incredibly important. In addition, they were working together to self-report their data and being able to manage then more and more around catch within those localized fishing zones.
It's about the sea, the science, the struggle, and the stories of the people fighting to keep the ocean alive. My name is Holden Hardcastle, and I'm an editor and producer of Rising Tide. Join us for a live podcast taping at KALW's Studio Event Space on Friday, April 24th, wrapping up SF Climate Week 2026. It's all happening at 220 Montgomery Street in downtown San Francisco. David Helvarg will be interviewing Louis Faisaios, Academy Award-winning director of The Cove and the new Netflix documentary, The Plastic Detox. Afterward, David will be signing copies of his new book, Forest of the Sea, The Remarkable Life and Imperiled Future of Kelp. So join us for a great opportunity to hear more about ocean climate and plastic climate connections. Find more information at kalw.org. The ocean's got a lot to say. Come and hear it live.
So in the U.S., we have the monitoring system. And I know initially, based on your book, and of course, many of us with experience with these folks who are out on the water, they don't want to be monitored. What shifted this skepticism into support within the U.S. system of the monitoring and the self-reporting?
After catch shares, you want your slice of the pie to grow. You start thinking, what's the fastest way to make it grow? I want to learn more from the scientists. I want to share my data with them. I want to make sure that if I can't cheat and none of us can cheat.
Yeah, and having that transparency is so important for the overall protection of the species and the ecosystems.
And yet it's the chaos factor is scary as you develop these systems. At the same time, climate is shifting. We've lost 50% of the kelp forest in just the last 40 years. Coral reefs are being killed off by heat. How do you adapt a system that's starting to work in an ocean that's rapidly changing?
It is existential and it's sort of everything all at once. How I think about breaking down the nature of that question is what can be done to create a more resilient ecosystem. Adaptation and resilience is incredibly important for the ocean. And what can you do now that's going to reduce the shocks that are going to come? The more resilient the system is, the more you have a highly diverse, complex system in place, particularly in coral reefs or those nearshore kelp forests that you talked about, the more likely they're going to be able to sustain themselves given that. And one way to think about that is you take the catch share model and the incentive that's built in for fishermen and stakeholders to like be part of the solution and build a more resilient system. The more you can knit those systems together in those coastal waters, the more likely you're going to be that as these populations shift in those coastal waters, as they move from the tropics to the poles, the more likely they're going to be successful in like coming through some of these really significant heat-related impacts.
And that ties into this whole idea of the concept of marine protected areas. Like, how do you protect particular regions of productivity or sensitive habitats? However, though, with catch shares, fishermen began avoiding sensitive areas on their own or important spawning regions. What changed within the fishermen's attitude about how these changes were made to protect those systems on their own without really relying on regulations, state laws, federal laws?
What Amanda was describing in Belize, you've seen elsewhere, where the fishermen know more than anyone about the value of protecting the nursery, of protecting the sources of regeneration or the habitats. They just had no reason to not fish those areas when they were competing with each other. Once they have a secure territorial spatial place that's just theirs, that's exclusive to them, they start seeing them as something that they can be done for them, that they can start saying, this is actually a fish bank where the interest spills over into the fishery. So the more capital, the natural capital, the habitat, the nursery, the aggregation and production zones are protected, the more spillover there's going to be. And that will help rebuild, Amanda said, my slice of this pie, this growing pie. And the more that's protected in that, the faster, then higher the yield. And so it's something that they embrace instead of fight against.
And it's interesting because the high profile stories are about these UN meetings where one nation pledges we'll set off 1 million square miles as a marine protected area, and another says, well, we'll do 2 million. And the smaller MPAs like in Port Orford, Oregon, or Puerto Rico, or the Philippines, that are fishermen bottom-up initiated MPAs, actually tend to be the fully protected biological reserves. As you write in your book, it's about engaging the constituencies that are actually on the water. In 2024, the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization reported that we've had another historic shift. We're now growing 131 million tons of seafood, farming it, versus 90 million tons of wild-caught fishery. So we have this major change. Aquaculture, like a lot of new industries, starts off dirty. It was all about shrimp farming and salmon farming. Now there's these dramatic shifts in aquaculture. Fishermen aren't thrilled with it, but some are transitioning. When I was in Alaska and Maine, there were like lobstermen who are now also farming kelp because they see the lobster going away. This isn't what this book's about, but I'm sure this is also what EDF's about.
So EDF is very supportive of sustainable aquaculture, and we help bring chefs and aquaculture leaders and commercial and fishermen together around these issues. And I think there's actually more in common there than there are differences. And it wasn't that long ago, I put the question straight to Buddy, the main character of the book we've been talking about, right? And he's like, hey, proof is in the pudding. If it can be done well, why would I be upset about that? If it's going to pollute or upset what I have in my ecosystem, then I'm going to take action. Mm-hmm. So, like, we are supporters of the Sustainable Aquaculture Research Act that's moving through Congress. That isn't actually the title, but it is bipartisan, and that's a pretty rare thing to say.
We talk about ecological or climate resilience. There's also political resilience, and putting more authority in local communities, local overseers, local fishermen builds that kind of political resilience so that while administrations all over the world will change and change back and so forth, you have a strong constituency, nonpartisan, bipartisan across the board, that says this is working for us. So when you say, let's make America's fisheries great again, they can come together and say, we are great again, and here's why and here's how. And that's an important thing, as we are rightly concerned about some of the changes from the capital in our country or other countries. This is something that endures because of that shift.
So when the people lead, the leaders will follow.
Yes, exactly. I think that's very true. Yeah.
What does the next phase look like for how we care about the ocean as a whole?
The next phase is leadership. When the people lead, the decision makers will follow, or some version of what you just said, David. I actually think that there are buddies all over the world. We don't know them all yet. We probably collectively, with your audience and the people we know, some of them. Mm-hmm. But I think the next phase is about supporting people like Buddy, who, even though he was an opponent to begin with, becomes a proselytizer of goodwill around the world, around what good fisheries look like and how they're possible, in a story of hope. The next phase, I think, should be, let's find all the buddies. Let's build the supports that they need so that they can be successful with their own fisheries in their own places.
Echo that, of course, but I'd take it also in a different direction, that it's not just, sea change isn't just a story about the sea and the ocean and the fishermen. It's about how we relate to the resources we depend on. And so you see the same challenges and patterns of the aquifers here in California. How do you solve that problem? Well, the same way we literally solved overfishing. You can allocate shares of the invisible resource among the users that we think of as bad guys. And instead of saying you can only pump for 3 hours a day or 2 months of the year, you can pump year round. But if you're careful about this, you'll replenish the aquifer instead of depleting it, because it will reward you for doing so, and your fuel will go down. And so you start learning the lessons of someone like Buddy, who we thought of as the bad guy, the pirate, to become a steward who's caring about the resource. And you can apply that to water, to forest, to fields and range management and biodiversity. And that's an exciting lesson, because we're all connected, not just to each other, but to this fabric we all depend on.
With that, I want to thank you, Jamie Workman and Amanda Leland, authors of Sea Change, for joining us on the Rising Tide Ocean podcast.
Enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on the Rising Tide Ocean podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen, and leave us a review or share it with your friends and other ocean lovers. Follow us on Instagram and visit bluefront.org for more updates and additional resources. Rising Tide is a production of Blue Frontier, co-hosted by David Helvarg and me, Vicki Nichols Goldstein of the Inland Ocean Coalition, with production support from Holden Hardcastle of Fluid Studios, Natasha Benjamin, and Nick Paz, and editing services provided by Charles Landon of Studio Cape May. Thanks for listening, and until next time, stay hopeful and stay salty.
Off in the salty ocean, off where the waves roll free. The sparkling water rises, then crashes to the sea. Out amongst the breakers, you'll have no need to fear. It's true, it's the blue frontier. Off in the salty ocean, off to the blue frontier.
Sparky, come here, buddy. Sparky! There you are. Good boy, Sparky.